Welcome to Khanversations. Today we are going to talk about race and politics in America. We will also talk about race and politics on campus and race and politics in the state of Delaware. I have with me two very important voices in the public sphere of Delaware. I have with me Senator Elizabeth Lockman, who represents the 3rd District of Delaware, which is the northern side of Wilmington. And I also have with me West and East part of Wilmington. And I have with me Professor Theodore Davis, who's one of the most senior professors in the Department of Political Science at the University of Delaware. So welcome to Khanversation, Professor Davis, Senator Lockman, welcome.
Thank you. Thanks so much.
So I want to start and dive into the deepest end of the pool. But before that, I want to ask this question. Every year, there is a commemoration and celebration of Black History Month in February. And I want you both to tell me, I mean, you've both been studying this phenomena for some time and have experienced it. How much does this help? And what more can we do to make the Black History Month not just a way to make people conscious about the evils of racism, but also to bring more social justice in our societies? So I'll start with Senator Lockman, then Professor Davis.
Sure, it's a great question. Happy Black History Month. And I think in 2022, I think we're grappling with how do we make sure Black History Month is, this leaping off point for something more expansive, as opposed to what I think some folks have become a little bit down on it, in the sense that it feels more marginalizing than the opposite of that, right? Like let's squeeze everything into the shortest month, the shortest, bleakest month of the year, quite frankly, where we'll just sort of cram some history in there. And I think what we're seeing instead, certainly we still want to highlight historical figures, but maybe take a little bit of an opportunity to look at some deeper cuts of history, but then also to step out of history and sort of look at history that's currently being made. So looking at our, peers and neighbors and citizens who are doing fascinating things that are making Black history, which I think is a really exciting new frontier. And then how can we use these conversations to make sure that this history, past or in the making, is not confined to the shortest, bleakest month of the year. So I think that's something that, certainly universities have an opportunity to highlight the history on their own faculties that's happened and is happening in their student bodies, and just, exciting news about things that maybe are always happening year round under the surface. It gives us an opportunity to shine a light and make sure that this month is just a platform and a jumping off point for appreciation.
Professor Davis.
Yeah. So I'm going to date myself. I remember when it was Black History Week. It was 1 week. Oh. It really wasn't until the late 1960s that it became a month. Mm-hmm. Now, there's a reason that Carter G. Woodson chose February to be Black History Week and now month, is because it was the birth date of Abraham Lincoln, and it is also the birth month, of Douglas, Frederick Douglass. Originally, Black History Month, I'm going to use the term, and it had an internal effect. In other words, it was supposed to be a month in which Black people got to learn about Black people. So the focus was more internal, and the same thing when it went to Black History Month. It was a way in which Black people could kind of explore their history. And so the focus was on about educating Black people about Black history. What has tended to happen in recent years, and trying to make a long story short, is that while the focus should still be on the month, internally, there's been kind of this external focus. So in other words, now the month is about educating other communities, perhaps more so than educating the Black community. I think we can always do more. Just to my position is, I think the Black community itself needs to take greater ownership in Black History Month. In other words, this should be an opportunity for us to tell our story, not only to our children, but also to the larger communities or to other communities, to inform them. I think that that's not happening.
So that's very interesting to know that it started as a week and then became a month, and then it was internal looking, and now it's public facing. So before I ask you the next question, which is the deep dive into the pool that I was talking about, I want to ask all of those who are watching this video to subscribe to Khanversations. If this is your first visit, like this video and also share it with your friends. This could be the thing that you do in the Black History Month to promote understanding of African American community and their socio-political reality in America. It's nearly 2 years now since we saw the horrific lynching and police brutality, which led to the killing of George Floyd on air for more than 8 minutes. And there was clearly a warranted and justifiable uproar, and people came out in streets and protests. Everyone was talking about how horrible that was, and it had to change, and people became aware of the way the police treated African Americans and the structural racism in this country, the economic, political, social marginalization of the African American community, the ongoing legacy of racism and slavery. More and more people have become familiar with it. I'm using this book to this month. My students in one of my classes will be reading. This is about the history of African Americans from 1619 till 1962. But I want to ask both of you, and Ted, we'll start with you. How much change has happened in the last nearly 2 years? What are the main positive things that have actually happened, which will ensure that the overall situation improves in our country?
Most of the change that has occurred locally. It hasn't been that national change. We haven't gotten that, quote, piece of legislation, that national piece of legislation. But I think there have been a number of positive things that have happened in a lot of local communities. The question now may be, why hasn't the change occurred nationally as opposed to locally? And I think it's, when it comes to big issues like this at the national level, the 1960s protest tactics are good for the date of the protests. And then when you get beyond the protests, then it's kind of out of sight. It's kind of, it's one of those situations wherein it doesn't result in anything. We could talk about the Black Lives Movement real quickly. I think the Black Lives Movement hasn't, 2 years beyond, still hasn't gotten its footing yet. It doesn't have an institutional foundation, which was a problem coming out of the 60s, because a lot of the 1960s Canada protest organizations, NAACP, Urban League, organizations like that, never institutionally got beyond this kind of protest mentality. What has happened with the Black Lives Movement is two things. One, it hasn't, even though they've made a lot of money, but there's still no institutional structure in place. And the other thing is that the Black Lives Movement itself was really hijacked by other groups. I always said to people, if you look closely at the Black Lives Matter, people came out and protest during the day, early evening, and then at nighttime, some other groups came out in the name of Black Lives Matter and began to engage in violence, and therefore that in itself that image, politicians, some people use that as a mechanism to be critical of, use this to really be critical of the legislation and to say, this is why we don't. And then you got people talk about defunding the police and folks going, well, what does that mean? And that was never explained. And so, that's kind of my take in terms of, I think we've seen some changes locally. I think locally in Delaware now, is it just Wilmington or Delaware where we got police cameras? I think we got some legislation or something where police cameras. Body cameras for police officers. So there have been some things that have happened locally, but not nationally.
Senator Lockman, what is your assessment of?
I mean, I shared some of Dr. Davis's position on that. I have a lot of thoughts, actually. I think, yes, we've seen some action locally. I think, pretty immediately after the killing of George Floyd, we did see some legislative organization. I'm part of the Delaware Legislative Black Caucus. And we put together an agenda, I think a fairly modest agenda, and we're able to take action on some elements of that. So codifying, a ban on chokeholds, which, wasn't accepted police practice, but it wasn't codified that would be something that would be banned. And certainly making sure that the body-worn camera program became law and supported by state resources. It's something that, I'm part of the Joint Finance Committee, and we're seeing how that is being absorbed into the budget even now. So that really is local progress. I think my first instinct is to say that the local, sort of the legislative outputs, even on the local level, are slow to come. And I think for me, having been out there the day after we saw unrest in downtown Wilmington was, it was quite painful, because being a legislator and being part of that legislative process, I know how slow and deliberative it is, even when the cause is urgent and even when the mandate ought to be very clear. It's just not something that ever comes to fruition overnight. So that was probably the most painful moment I've ever had as an elected official, and sort of seeing the faces of citizens in so much pain and wanting to see change immediately and knowing that this takes a long time. But that said, I do think that we did see some progress and change that is meaningful. It's still a long game, but what I feel like I have seen, having attended a lot of protests, a lot of different kinds of protests, sort of under the banner of Black Lives Matter. Not only did we see some of those big movements, some of which became problematic, most of which did not. In familiar spaces, that was, I think, very wonderful and very powerful. We also were seeing them, I think, in places that were unusual, our small towns, our suburban municipalities. People were showing up, and I think I did one, I walked with community members in Rockford Park, we're going out there with Black Lives Matter and a true grasp of what is behind this. We're talking about white supremacy. We're talking about injustice. And I think that was a big change. And I think, that kind of, heart and mind shift is very much an important building block towards ultimately being able to make meaningful policy change. And I think we did turn something of a corner. I mean, there's certainly more work to be done. But another outgrowth of the protest, it can feel like it peters out when you don't have those big dramatic moments where glass is being smashed or highways are being blocked. But I actually think what is happening is a lot of the folks who are really engaged in that stuff are getting more involved in organized policy-making advocacy, which is wonderful. I think that's exactly what you want. It's like, how do you follow? You go out and you get loud and you make your point, but how do you follow through to actually make sure that policy change is happening? And I can think of half a dozen small advocacy entities that have been outgrowths of that organizing work that created those big protests are actually still in the trenches, looking at specific legislation they'd like to see done, raising issues, attending, committee hearings and things like that. And so these are all components of progress that I think are very promising that I was not seeing before, everything inflected after George Floyd's killing. So I see room for optimism. People have been persistent. It's been a long time to wait to see some of these things happen, like reforming, amending the Law Enforcement Officer Bill of Rights. But people are still right in there, and they're still very passionate, and they're doing the work. And then folks who are not on those front lines are thinking about it, talking about it, using language that they never used before. So I see a difference.
I agree. I marched with my wife and kids in several of those marches in downtown Newark and Wilmington. But it is a bit sobering, Senator Lockman, coming from you. You are the third most powerful individual in the Senate. You are a Senate whip. You should be carrying a whip like Wonder Woman, I think, as a Senate whip. But in a deep blue state like ours, to say that legislation is coming slowly, that's a bit sobering. And that takes me to my next question. The freedom to vote bill, the voting rights bill, its failure to go anywhere. 52 senators feel comfortable denying it. More than a majority of US senators feel that in spite of everything, they can be stumbling blocks to ensure, because it's not just about enfranchising the African American community, but it's also about defending and preserving our democracy. So how do you understand, and how do you react, and how are the African American community reacting to the failure of the Biden administration and the current US Congress to basically pass this bill?
I mean, I have to admit, I don't understand it. It's very confounding. I mean, and I think it's something that we see repeatedly. I think it's part of our frustration with Congress and action on the federal level. Like you said, we're a deep blue state. We send folks who we feel will vote the right way on these things. But I guess to some extent, it's the nature of this democratic beast that we've created, that not all states are sending folks with that take on things, and they are able to, or perhaps compelled to, act the way that they do because of what their constituents are going to support. So I mean, I think it is, to some degree, it's either a reflection of the desires of their constituency, or it's a reflection of the lack of engagement of their constituents to hold them accountable for those actions. It's frustrating. It is very shocking to me. I mean, I think locally we live our own version of this. It's different, but I think every local legislature has its own dynamics of who feels what is the right thing that they need to do to best reflect the priorities of the people that they represent. And sometimes, I would say oftentimes, even within this deep blue state, what that yields is much more moderate action than people feel makes good sense. And it's easy for me to say that and feel that when I represent an extremely diverse and pretty progressive constituency. I have my moderacy there, but not everybody does. And so I think it's a virtue of the democratic process, but it's a real, like you said, it's a stumbling block that we are very deliberative and ultimately very conservative from a procedural standpoint and how we do things, that we can get away with standing in the way of something that seems like such obviously needed progress. Because I think, we'll see when people campaign and whether they get elected. I think you'll see that a lot of folks probably will not suffer a negative consequence for making this, one might say, conservative choice on this bill that is shocking to those of us who care about justice and progress, particularly when it comes to voting rights. But yeah, I think it's somewhat the nature of the beast of democracy, and that is amplified on the federal level. It's very slow, very, very slow to bend the arc of justice, right, in the right direction. It's a very it's like an iron beam. It's not a little soft kind of an arc, right? So it's tough and it's time consuming, and sometimes doing the right things feels very elusive and very defensible on a technicality, right? It's sad.
How do you see that, Ted?
Yeah, so again, I'm coming kind of thinking about it in an academic context. And if we look at civil rights and voting rights, particularly as it relates to Blacks, we haven't had a lot of victories since the 1960s. And so I'm thinking about, well, why is this the case? And more particularly, why are we having problems getting the Freedom to Vote Act and John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act passed? I bring it down to this, that we have to think about this, trying to address this problem. We either address it from a perspective of morality or legality. All of the victories, the primary victories in terms of Black civil rights, have come primarily through legality. Now, other groups that come, subsequent groups that have come with their movements on the heels of Blacks, have been able to appeal to what I'm referring to as the morality. And it's very difficult using morality in order to advance these pieces of legislation, because there are a lot of people, a lot of whites that think, look, we've done quite a bit for Blacks. We don't need to do much more. So you can't appeal to the morality, and people out there saying, well, Blacks can't vote anymore, which isn't true. But I think in terms of, even when we talk about the Freedom to Vote Act, the John Lewis legislation, we have to listen to what the Supreme Court said. The Supreme Court basically said that, look, you all got to come up with some new formulas, because we can't use 1964 formulas in 2010, whenever it was. Mm-hmm. So you got to come up with new formulas. That's illegal. That's something that we need to be doing, having our students do in the university, so we can go back into the courts and say, okay, this is how we can demonstrate this. All of this, kind of protesting and this 1960s type tactics again, it's not going to work, because America, unfortunately, we are a moral nation if we've ever been, but we certainly are far away from it. We're getting further and further away now. So you cannot appeal to people to do the right thing. That's just not going to work. So you're going to have to fight it out in the legal system. And I think on the national level, that's where the problem is.
You make a very interesting point about the distinction between what is legal and what is moral. I would like to believe that our legal system has a morality of its own and is based on certain moral values. But I want to touch upon, all of us are connected with the university environment. Senator Lockman is also an adjunct professor in public policy. She occasionally teaches at the University of Delaware. Has there been any significant changes at the university level? I'm assuming that universities are the most enlightened pockets of our country. So in these enlightened domains, has there been any significant positive steps towards realizing social justice and reducing discrimination and racism, Ted?
You want me to start with that one first? Or you?
Yes, we'll start with you. I will let the senator have the last word on that.
I think the university, let me just put this out. I think the University of Delaware is well-intentioned. And I think that the University of Delaware really would like to bring about change. But as the senator teaches public policy, and when we talk about understanding public policy and policy decisions either fall into the category of they're routine, they're analogous, or they creative. And at best, when it comes to issues regarding minorities at the University of Delaware, not just the University of Delaware, but in higher education in general. The issues are somewhat new, and we have a tendency to look out and say, okay, this is how we've kind of dealt with this in the past, so we're going to try this again or try a new variation. So in other words, back in the early 90s and the 80s, we had affirmative actions officers. Now we call them diversity and inclusion officers. It's the same thing, you just put a different title on it. The problem is, until we get some creativity, until we begin to think outside of the box, right? I mean, really, seriously, if you've got a diversity officer, your chief diversity officer is reporting to the president of the university, that chief executive officer isn't going to do a lot except within the context of what they think that president is going to allow them to do, because they got a job that is dependent upon what they say. They got a mortgage, they got children in college and in school, and they want to go on vacations just like everyone else. So maybe if we're going to really begin to deal with this issue at the university, maybe we need some independent external body to really oversee this process so that they don't have to worry about if we go back to the president. Now, if you got a president that's really committed, that really understands the issue, and it's driven top down, right, then you're going to make some changes. But the university itself hasn't been very creative. I think I put something on my Facebook the other day that said something to the extent that one of the problems is, white people like the idea of diversity and inclusion, etc. But when it comes to implementation, the idea, doesn't, the actual implementation and applying it doesn't match the idea. And so we've got, how do we get people, and people aren't going to, see, when you, in the 80s, now stop here, when the University of Delaware really made a push towards trying to desegregate, there was federal legislation, and the University of Delaware was very proactive in terms of, and I was one of those individuals. We're going to bring in minorities, and not only are we going to bring in one, but we're going to bring in one or two, right? Because the law was there was this external pressure on the university. Yes, we have middle states, but right. But okay, I'll stop there. But
basically, your point is that unless there is an autonomous body supervising some kind of, or there is an incentive, the internal inertia of the university, it can only do so much. If I'm not.
Well, it's only going to. It can be top down, but you got to really have. And I'm not trying to be critical of anybody that's in office of president. But unless you have a president that's just said, look, this is my top priority, that I'm going to really give my diversity and inclusion officer, whatever they come to me and say, I'm going to do it. I'm not going to think about, okay, how much this is going to cost me, what alumni am I going to offend? See, the president of the university got a lot of things to think about. Yeah. And a lot of constituencies too that they've got to please, and they aren't going, and the money, unless the money constituencies, so those people out there who they get money from, if those people began to say to the president of the university, look, we want this to happen. Now the president has his or her okay, and they can make this happen. So until we begin to think about this thing with some level of creativity, and again, we got to get away from thinking about not using 1960, 1970 tactics and policies and methodologies to deal with issues regarding race today. It's nice. The idea is nice, but the idea isn't doing much for me.
And I have a couple relatively quick thoughts on this front. One being that I agree. I think the first thing you said, the intent is there, right? There's good intention. And I've experienced that. As you said, I'm an adjunct occasionally, and I teach in the Associates in Arts program in the city of Wilmington. So I'm in a program that is very much geared towards, students who kind of need some special care to transition them into a 4-year degree setting. And so I was extremely excited and still am. I love the program. I think it's fantastic. But I think, I see a couple of things that I think are remarkable in that space. First, I see a faculty that is extremely committed, to equity and diversity and having difficult conversations about all the implications of that, both when we're talking along racial dimensions, but also just generally socioeconomic disadvantage and what that means for our students. But something that I've seen from the beginning is that even in that space, which is designed for Delaware students of less means and of less opportunity to get a foothold in, our flagship university in the state, is that, I don't necessarily see my constituents reflected in that student body either. So like we're talking city of Wilmington, some deep multi-generational poverty, just to be frank, Black students, Black and Hispanic, but it was specifically Black students. You don't necessarily see a very strong presence there. You certainly don't see as strong of a presence of students coming out of tougher K-12 environments. We see a lot of students coming from some of our more strong public and even parochial options. So there's still a disparity even in who's accessing this special leg up. And I think the pandemic has absolutely exacerbated that disparity. In the beginning, I was seeing some of that diversity, although it was more students from the county than the city. And now I'm seeing even less of the students of color. And it's really unfortunate. And I don't think it has anything to do with the intent and the compassion and the desire for us to innovate and do different things to get these students in.
You're saying that the efforts that are being made to address racial inequality are being somehow subverted by class inequality.
Right. Well, yeah, absolutely. And I think there's systemic barriers, particularly in that K-12 pathway, that you're getting to the point of where by the time students are walking in the door of a program like the AAP program, which is free and has, a certain academic threshold, there's a whole lot of students who are already counted out. And those students are by and large your low-income Black and Brown students. They're the ones who are able to sort of clear that threshold to take advantage of this wonderful opportunity are, already, it's already a bit of creaming that is happening. And so that's a frustration I have about really being able to deliver on that. And then just briefly to Ted's other point, and I think it just speaks to this idea of like, we're not a moral nation, right? What really compels us to do moral things is sort of in my experience as a legislator, it's like, how can I turn this into a bottom line, make it about money and convince you that the ethical thing to do is also efficient and the most affordable thing we can do. And so I think what I've seen is this conversation is emerging amongst my colleagues who are thinking more like this when we're sitting in joint finance and all of our higher eds come before us. I think increasingly, I don't know that we're that perfect impartial external body, but certainly we ask questions. How many students from Delaware? What do the demographics of this student body look like? And the less we like those answers, the less we really want to invest. And so I think that's a promising sign and also, a place that, we can see direction in that. Because I'll be honest, when we see the demographics at a Delaware Tech and how much that not just reflects Delaware, but really leans into, traditionally underrepresented groups, people get excited. And that's a good thing. That's going to motivate change.
I hope so. I hope President Assanis is watching this. I will definitely send him tag him with this, and maybe he can have a lunch with both of you. It will be great. And of course, he is welcome to come on Khanversations and talk about these issues. One of the things that has happened in the last couple of years is academic institutions and how we talk about race and how we teach people about prejudice. I have been working on issues of Islamophobia for a while. How we talk about these things has suddenly become very politicized with this discussion of critical race theory and the fact that it is teaching. It is becoming a kind of a game changer in elections. People say that the Virginia election was hugely impacted by this fear of critical race theory, and also the 1690 project, if you notice, with the 10-year crisis of Nicole Hannah Jones with University of North Carolina. So that has also kind of I hope it's not putting universities and academics on the back foot. This semester, my students are reading the original 1619 book by Leron Bennett. I have not read the book. This is one of the first things I want to read before this month is out. So my question to you, Tizzy, is that as we go forward, is this resistance to change going to get uglier and uglier? Or can we find a way in dealing with this? I mean, I hate to use this word, but in a more democratic and a more friendly way to understand that this is an enduring problem, and it's time we really address prejudice and take it head on.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think the conversation is going away, and I think we're really going to see that tested. As I think you probably know, House Bill 198 was passed. That's Representative Sherry Dorsey Walker's bill that I was able to lead in the Senate, and that was focusing on, we also often call it the Black History Bill, but it's really not just focused on history. It's about making sure the Black experience is reflected across disciplines. And so now, again, kind of to the point of what we talked about before, and the different representation we're seeing of people being engaged in the process. Sometimes we pass a bill and then we just cross our fingers and hope something happens. I've seen an amazing groundswell of supporters for that bill, wanting to make sure to follow through and see it, see that it's actually implemented adequately. Now, that doesn't mean that there's not pushback from folks who sort of are carrying this anti-CRT banner, whether or not they understand what CRT is, or the fact that I would argue you can't really teach critical race theory in the K-12 space because, right, it's illegal. Sort of mode of thinking, but and we've talked a lot about that. But I think there is a dedication to making sure that this bill serves as a catalyst to make sure that our educators are trained and made comfortable in facilitating these conversations amongst themselves and certainly for their students. And then also, of course, making sure that we are a state that loves local control, that that the curriculum ultimately is being made locally. It's being made with the engagement of communities, and hopefully prioritizing the voices of those who are traditionally marginalized. But everyone's going to get a say when these things are coming up and these conversations are happening at the school board level. So I don't think we've seen the end of the negative pushback, but I also think we're also starting to see a bit of a counter push from people's fellow community members, from educators who are like, these are really important things. I'm seeing educators being very defensive and very protective of their right to teach and to help students to think critically on the K-12 level, which I think is really wonderful and a great sign. So I don't think the fight and the aggression over it is over, because I don't think we fully demystified. We haven't given people sort of the training and the information that they need yet. But I think over the next couple of years, hopefully we'll see, that strong democratic process that allows people to come into the spaces, have uncomfortable conversations about their fears, hopefully have their fears dispelled, so that we can actually get to a place where we are teaching everyone's experience to every student. And I think that will go a long way to hopefully overcoming some of what you're describing, some of the ugliness that we've seen.
What do you think, Ted?
Well, I think the problem is that we have too many politicians that are that are willing to politicize this for the wrong reason. Mm-hmm. That instead of thinking about, we need elected officials who are going to think about what's good for the community, not necessarily what's good for getting me elected or re-elected. Mm-hmm. So we need leadership to come out and to, even if it's going to cost me, that's why I'm in favor of term limits. But we need a situation wherein people are going to take leadership. And one of the things you had talked about, we talked about before, was this idea of this possible civil war. How do we get out of this? Well, the way we get out of this is talking back to, bringing people back to the middle, as opposed to running people to their silos on the extremes and nobody there is talking to one another. So I just think that until we have people, and although I said politicians, but they aren't the only one, but people who are willing to stop politicizing this for their own personal gain. Stuff like critical race theory, because critical race theory is just a framework. It's just like you and I as political scientists, we understand how society operates in a political context, how resources are allocated, how we determine what the values are going to be. Sociologists they understand society in terms of human relationships, economists in terms of the distribution of goods and services. Critical race theory just works from the standpoint that race is central to understanding America, right? There's nothing wrong with that as a foundation. It doesn't mean that it doesn't have to pit you against me.
I can't believe that I'm actually saying something that maybe people like Ted Cruz have a point. See, I think the fear is much more serious, that they are afraid that if people begin to actually accept this argument that racial discrimination is central to certain aspects of the United States, its origin, and has played such a dominant role in the way the US has evolved over the years, it essentially basically undermines the moral nature of the majority of the population and paints them as racists. And that is the fear, that people think that if we say that race has played a huge role in the creation, production, and evolution of America, then that means Americans are racist. And I think that is what they're afraid of, isn't it?
Yeah, I understand that, but we got to have that conversation. We got to deal with it, and we've got to understand, in terms of making some of these terms bad terms and exploiting them. Yeah. Is not good. It's not healthy. Let's try to. And this is the other thing. I think we need to explain, people in positions of power. We don't, and the Democratic Party is terrible about this. In terms of explaining the position to people, like, don't just assume that people understand. That you have to explain to people why there's inflation. You have to explain to people why it's necessary. Don't just assume I can put it out there at one moment and people are going to get it. Republicans, they know how to exploit and use the negative when they need to. They can be positive when they want to, but they know how to use the media in terms of communication. So it's about communications and how we utilize, especially mass media, social media, and all of that.
They boil it down. Yeah, they boil it down to a quick talking point or a catchphrase. And as we can certainly talk as we do about what critical race theory really is, but the term has come to represent something that means something to people, much like what Dr. Khan described.
It's the fear. It plays on
people's fear that everything is a lie, and if we expose the lie, we lose it all.
Right.
Yeah, and from a campaign strategy wise, I think the Republicans are very good at weaponizing the negative, then Democrats are at explaining the positives.
Right.
But having said that, this is the last question, and it is an interesting question, but I would like you to be briefer. So one of the promises that President Biden has made and repeated it is that he's going to nominate an African-American woman to the Supreme Court. The vacancy that is coming up. And then lots of people are saying, oh, this is affirmative action, and others are saying it's long overdue. Regardless of what happens, he could probably pick the most competent person to be in that seat. And if she's an African American, there will be those who said who will insist that this is an identity agenda. And I want both of you to react to this situation. And I also have a small adjunct question. How has the first Black, I don't think it was the first Black, Clarence Thomas, how has his tenure on Supreme Court helped the Black community? He's now the longest serving Supreme Court justice, I think, since
Justice Thomas?
Yeah, since 1991.
I remember that.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I can be very brief to the idea about, is it controversial to make this commitment? I think my answer would be that is not controversial. So I couldn't be much briefer than that. But I mean, I know there have been detractors to this avow, and I think, we always have those. I personally don't know that is. I think sometimes we give equal weight to opposing opinions, right? And I'm not sure that there really is an equal weight that's deserved by the folks who are bringing up that idea that, no, that's affirmative action. I mean, when you have Lindsey Graham coming out very publicly and saying it wouldn't be because here's this wonderful candidate, I think, again, we're seeing progress in people understanding that representation does matter. Now, has it mattered in the case of Justice Thomas? I mean, obviously he is, a more conservative justice who goes with that side of things. But, and could this new nominee potentially sort of double down on that? Possibly, especially I would think if Lindsey Graham is enthusiastic about it. But I do think at the end of the day, representation absolutely matters, and it's not controversial, I don't think, to look to fill seats on the basis of identity. And that does not necessarily inherently mean that person is going to be a committed social justice warrior. Right. So I think that's just something that we have to grapple with. Isn't that still progress? Is it? Maybe, I mean, that we could have a whole other hour conversation.
Yeah, plus we are a representative democracy, and identity is one form of representation. Yes, Ted.
Yeah, I really do think that President Biden is a good person and he has a good heart. And I think he means well. I think sometimes this kind of make things, because the heart is saying one thing, the heart is speaking, and so he speaks what the heart is speaking in terms of this is what we need to do. Mm-hmm. But when you're speaking from the heart to, I don't know what to call that other segment out there, it can become very problematic. And so some of these things that I know he wants to do these things, let's not advertise it. let's just hey, let's just say, this is what I'm going to do, but I'm not going to put it out there, because once you put it out there, you've got, people out there waiting to pounce on it. Yeah. And so I think I think it would have served him best not to say it, just do it.
I looked at the CVs of some of the candidates whose names are being floating around, and they are stunning. They are stunningly competent. I can tell you, they are young. They are incredibly smart.
When has competency ever mattered when putting people on the Supreme Court in recent years? You started out talking about Clarence Thomas. When did competence? He should have never been on the Supreme Court.
That's a great way to as a
what a circus.
Yeah. So I want to thank Professor Davis and also Senator Elizabeth Lockman. You're both doing fantastic work. I have a front seat here in Delaware, seeing the wonderful things that both of you are doing. And I want to thank you very much. And I'll thank you very much, Professor Davis and Senator Lockman.
Thank you, Dr. Khan.
Thank you very much. And those of you who have enjoyed the show, please subscribe to the channel, share it with everybody on social media. And if some of you are professors, then please try and use this in your classroom to initiate conversations about social justice in the Black History Month. And I want everybody, if possible, to read at least one book about the history of African Americans in this month. Everybody. It'll be great. So thank you very much. Thank you to both of you.
Thank you.